A lot of people have been talking about the Karma comp, but the big question is how do we play it and how do we get into all the late game compositions that you could also transition with this comp as well. So we're going to be going over how to play Dawnbringers, how to play the early, mid, and late game, go over the leveling patterns, every single itemization you can think of, and we'll also provide a lot of tips and tricks, including positioning and alternative champions. So be sure to stick around for this guide and watch the whole thing if you are interested in actually getting better at the Karma comp in TFT. So first things first, Dawnbringers received a big buff. They now deal 12% damage instead of 10%. And because of this, Dawnbringers have pretty much become from like a C tier comp into S or A tier. So with that in mind, one of the strengths of this composition is that it has a super strong late game cap, and it is pretty consistent because of the new buffs. The two downsides that I would say come with this comp is that Karma sometimes has unreliable targeting, and this comp is also very weak against Assassins. Luckily, Assassins got a huge nerf, so no one's really playing them, which is another reason why this composition is so strong. So with that in mind, this is what a sample comp at level 8 looks like. We have a Karma, Soraka, and Ivern in the back line, and we have Gragas and Riven protecting them. And then in the front line, we have Garen, Warmog's very critical on Garen, and then Volibear and Nidalee to round out 6 Dawnbringer, Ivern, and Volibear. So you may notice that Karma has 3 items on her. She has Blue Buff, Jeweled Gauntlet, and Hat. You could use all sorts of different combinations on Karma, and we're going to go into all those substitutions. She's actually not that item reliant compared to many other 4-cost carries. So now that we know the composition, let's go into the leveling pattern. So this composition plays with the standard level 8 pattern, and this is typically the leveling pattern that you use with all types of 4-cost carries. So for level 4, you want to level up at stage 2-1, and this is especially true if you hit a strong board. If not, you could always wait until 2-2 where you naturally level up to level 4. If not, you can naturally level up at stage 2-3, which is generally what you do if you are trying to lose streak in the early game. For level 5, you typically want to hit this at stage 2-5 while keeping at least 10 gold. But worst case scenario, if you are doing the lose streak start, you could level up on stage 3-1 in that scenario. Level 6 is where all the paths converge, whether you're win streaking, lose streaking, or none of the above. You want to hit level 6 on stage 3-2 with at least 30 gold, and you could roll a bit here if you have a lot of pairs on your bench, or if you are 1 unit away from a major synergy, such as getting like 4 Dawnbringer at level 6. For level 7, you level up at 4-1, and then you roll down as much as possible to stabilize your board. This typically means a Karma 1-star, but we will get into more details when we talk about the mid-game. For level 8, you want to reach this on stage 4-5 if you did not roll on 4-1. Otherwise, you could level up on stage 5-1 if you did roll beforehand. After that, level 9, this is actually something that happens pretty often with this composition because you end up getting a super strong late game because the Karma just carries you all the way to level 9, and then you eventually swap out your board for a ton of legendary units. So you typically hit level 9 sometime in late stage 5 or early stage 6, depending on how the game went. Now that we know the leveling patterns, let's go into the items. So we are going to be going over every single possible item you could build for all your carries, all your tanks, as well as some situational and team buffing items. So first off, we are going to pay attention to Karma's mana items. So Karma always wants at least 1 mana item, either Spirit Shojin or blue buff. It's not the end of the world if you don't get it, as long as you have some sort of tier item on her, such as Archangels or a Hand of Justice, but I definitely do prefer the Spirit Shojin or the blue buff as one of the preferred tier items. The reason why you want this is because getting her first cast off is so critical, and this helps her get all her subsequent casts that much faster, which ends up helping you win a lot of different fights. So I do prefer Shojin over the blue buff because oftentimes it's pretty difficult to get 2 tiers, and swords are pretty useless for this comp, so I generally like building a Spirit Shojin as much as I can. For example, in one of the games I'm going to analyze in a future video, we started off the game with 2 tiers and a sword. Instead of building the blue buff, I went for the Shojin because then you could save the extra tier for Archangels or for a Hand of Justice. I will say though that there is one scenario where blue buff is better than Shojin, and that is when you have 4 invokers with the Karma. Blue buff is 1 auto attack better than the Spirit Shojin, but that scenario is really rare. By the time you get to 4 Invoker, you typically run a Teemo carry instead of a Karma carry, which is why the itemization doesn't matter as much as you think. So just to sum that up, either item is perfectly good. Shojin is just a little more convenient to make, but blue buff is technically the better item in one other scenario. So for the offensive items, you generally want 2 of these. The best ones are Jeweled Gauntlet, Sacrificial Jeweled Gauntlet, Rabadon's Caustic Death Cap, and Rabadon's Death Cap. Any combinations of these is going to be really good. So what I've found is that normally Hat is really good against most compositions, but if you're facing a lot of other Karma players, I generally prefer to have a Jeweled Gauntlet because this often meets her threshold of one-shotting the enemy Karma, and Because of the Dawnbringer buff, Dawnbringer heals Karma all the way back up to full health if she drops below a certain health threshold. This one shot pretty much negates that. This is true for a lot of other different champions, which is why Jeweled Gauntlet sometimes is needed, but sometimes it's not. It really just depends on who you are facing and how many tank items they have. Pretty much, if Hat is not enough to one-shot enemy carries, you generally want the Jeweled Gauntlet, but if it is enough, then you don't need the Jeweled Gauntlet, and Jeweled Gauntlet ends up being worse. Alternatives to these damage items is Hand of Vengeance, Evil Giant Slayer, Regular Giant Slayer, and Archangel Staff. These are like playable, but you really don't want these. You generally want to stick to the 4 items we mentioned before. However, you can't always get those items every game. If I had to choose between like the best alternative items, I'd go for probably the Shadow Hand of Vengeance and the Archangel Staff. Now onto frontline items. This is generally for your Garen, for your Volibear, things like that. Warmogs is the most important item on Garen because Warmogs just work so beautifully with him. But Guardian Angel, Fallen Guardian Angel are both really strong in the late game. Gargoyle, Stoneplate, both versions are good. The Shadow version is better in the early game, and the regular version is better in the late game. Sacrificial Redemption and Regular Redemption are great as well. Sometimes I put it on Taric if I play him in a late game build. And then Titan's Resolve and Morello Namicon are pretty good Garen and Volibear items in the late game to give them more damage. And then Zizarot Portal is always useful because you end up never needing bow in this composition, so it's just a good way to use off that item. Now for support items, obviously Chalice of Malice or Chalice of Power are both really good. Zeke's Herald is pretty decent as well to buff up your Karma to get her auto attacks that much faster, which makes her cast that much earlier. Now let's move on to the utility items. So utility items, they're the same for every comp, essentially. It's going to be Zephyr, Shroud of Stillness, and Banshee's Claw. These are all like the best utility items that are like versatile in every single composition. All comps can use these, and they're just great to take in the late game. Banshee's Claw is a new item to this list because we've already went over Zephyr and Shroud of Stillness so many times before, but essentially Banshee's Claw gives 3 units on your team a spell block, which is super useful, especially in a Karma meta. So now in terms of spatula items, Dawnbringer Spat's going to be by far the best spatula item, apart from Force of Nature and Shadow Force of Nature, but those are pretty hard to get. After that, Renewer Spat is pretty useful on Garen, and then Revenant Spat is pretty good on most units on your team if they need a GA effect. And it also buffs the HP of Volibear and Ivern on their respawn. So now that we have that out of the way, let's go over the carousel priorities. So the 3 items I want you guys to go for in the first carousel are Rod, Tear, and Belt. These are by far the best. Belt is so good for all of the defensive items, and it builds Dawnbringer Spatula. Tear is so good because, well, we need a lot of tears to get Karma going. And then Rod, you need a lot of APs as well because that's how Karma does damage. And then after that, the last ones you want are Sword, Bow, and Negatron. So that is pretty much all you want to go for in the first carousel. The first 3 are by far the best, so really try to get one of those. And for example, if like Tear's really contested but Rod isn't, just go for the Rod or like Belt. If that's the case, like sometimes one of these random lobbies, like everyone wants like a Belt, for example, and then you can't get Belt, then go for Rod and Tear. So now let's get into the early game now that we are completely done with the itemization. So early game, that's going to be stages 1 and 2. And during these times, you want to be playing your strongest board as possible, and this is typical for most compositions. However, you will want to hold a lot of Dawnbringer units in order to transition because Dawnbringers are so good in stage 3 in the like mid game, so you definitely want to prep yourself for that board. So let's go over item holders. For Karma, item holders for her are Lissandra, Ziggs, Brand, Victor, and Katarina and Lee Sin. Let's go over compositions for each of these champions. So the first one is an Assassin opener with a Katarina. Sometimes you just get Katarina from a box, and if you do, put the mana items on her. Blue buff is really effective for that. And you know how we had the whole Shojin versus blue buff discussion? Well, itemize whoever your item holder is early. So Katarina is a great user of blue buff, so if we had the choice between building blue buff or Shojin, we'd probably build the blue buff, even though we said Shojin is typically more practical because blue buff is just much better on Cat, and that means you are going to be able to win streak or save HP a little more effectively than you would have if you built Shojin. So we have here 2 Assassin, 2 Brawler, 2 Dawnbringer, and 3 Forgotten. We have the tank items on Gragas. Gragas is a great holder because you just sell him once you get Garen, and it's a pretty easy switch and swap there. Next build is Spellweaver. This is going to be Hecarim and Warwick in the front line, Gragas as well, and then Brand and Victor in the back line. Brand is another great user of blue buff. He is going to be your item holder for the Karma, and Warwick is a great item holder for the tank items. And here are a couple other variations you can run. This one's a Renewer opener. You have Lissandra here, Vladimir to hold your tank items in the front, and then you combine it with Covens with Morgana, LeBlanc, and then Kha'Zix as an assassin. Upgraded Renewers give you like a great opener to work with. You could play Coven like I mentioned before, or you could go into some sort of Nightbringer comp with Lee Sin and Sejuani if you happen to get those. Lots of different options here. The next and last early game comp I want to go over is the Redeemed opener. This one is with Syndra as your item holder. She has a Shodan, she has a Jeweled Gauntlet. Aatrox works great with tank items, and Aatrox is pretty much a crank early game because he is just such an effective item holder, along with dealing a lot of healing that a lot of teams can't burst through. My favorite part about the Redeemed opener is that if you don't get Karma, you could always transition into Vel'Koz if you happen to hit Vel'Koz because you have Spear Shojin and a bunch of ability power items to work with. Now onto the mid game. This is going to be stages 3 and 4. So again, we level up to level 6 at stage 3 too, and here are a couple of boards there. You typically want to roll down until you hit one of these, but sometimes you already have them going into that round. But this first one we are going to go over is the Assassin opener again. This is a 4 Assassin build with Nocturne, Kha'Zix, Katarina, and LeBlanc. Gragas and Warwick in the front line, same as before, we just added on a few extra units. You don't have to run 4 Assassins, you could run stuff like 4 Brawlers, 4 Dawnbringers, or 3 Forgotten, or just like 2 one-off synergy traits instead. So even though like this is a pretty nice board, you don't have to go for exactly 4 Assassins. Next up is the Spellweaver opener. This is the one we had with Brand and Victor before. So you could always do like an Abomination board because Brand is an Abomination. Nunu's a brawler that works with Gragas really well, and then you just add in the random Callista, and sometimes you even hit a Rise at this point in the game. Like sometimes it happens, not often, but Abominations is a great start if you do have a Brand item holder. If you do not get one of these, you could do something like 4 Brawlers instead, or add in more Dawnbringers like we talked about before. Next up is the Renewer opener. This one was the one we had with Coven, and we simply just added in a Soraka here to round out the composition because she is just going to be a unit that you need later. And you could always use this flex spot as just any strong 2-star unit that you happen to find on your shop. Next up is level 7. This is going to be stage 4-1. This is where you want to hit the 6 Dawnbringer with the 1 Invoker's power spike. So the Invoker that you can play is preferably Ivern, but he's pretty hard to hit. So we could always use Syndra instead. But 6 Dawnbringer, pretty important for this. You don't have to have 6 Dawnbringer, but I much prefer to do it. Let's say you are 100 health and you have like 4 Dawnbringer. Maybe you don't have to roll. But if you are like 50 health with only 4 Dawnbringer, I would definitely roll for the 6 Dawnbringer. If you already have 6 Dawnbringer, then you could kind of chill and the decision is a little bit easier. So again, however much gold you roll at level 7 really depends on your game state, but a general rule of thumb is if you don't have Nidalee 2 and Riven 2, you will generally need other defensive units for your frontline because this composition is very frontline reliant because you're pretty much just buying as much time as you can for Karma to pop off. So you can run stuff like random 2-star frontline such as Rel and a different Cavalier. Maybe you're running 2 Mystics, maybe you just happen to hit a Mordekaiser or a Taric 2 just from rolling down. So when I roll down, I typically buy all the 4-cost tanks, and if I just hit one of them randomly, I just go ahead and play it, even if it's not the specific one that I want. Because at the end of the day, even though you want to play 6 Dawnbringers, we can't always get this every single game. And I'm actually gonna include some VODs of some of my games where I'm trying to go the 6 Dawnbringer build, but it's really not working out, so you'll be able to see what I do when I can't get Karma or when I can't get a specific synergy. So now onto the late game. This is going to be stage 5 and beyond. We are going to be rolling down to pretty much 0 at level 8. And at this point, like, you'll definitely need the 6 Dawnbringers if you held off from before, preferably with a Garen, but you don't always hit Garen, so you need to run Gragas or Kha'Zix instead at that point. I like to use Nunu and Mordekaiser as an item holder if you did not use Gragas before for all my Garen items. And if you hit Volibear before Garen, I know in the picture here, Garen's holding all the items. You could just throw all the items on Volibear if you just get him first, because honestly, even though items are better on Garen, if you hit the Volibear first, you might as well take advantage of the power spike by putting all your items on him. If we are able to level up even more, or if we get some lucky rolls on level 8 and we get some 2-star legendaries, you could run stuff like Heimerdinger 2 instead of some of the units here, and add like a Taric for Knights if you are able to get it. So typically when this happens, I try to pivot out of Karma into the super late game build that we have always talked about on this channel, which is like the HIV combination, which is Heimerdinger, Ivern, and Volibear, plus a Teemo for Invokers. It's a very strong build for a Heimerdinger carry if you just manage to hit it. Lots of different outs in this build, like so many different legendaries that you could randomly get 2-star that could single-handedly carry your team. So let's get into some level 9 variations. The first one we have here is a 4 Dawnbringer build with the Heimerdinger with 4 Renewers, and this one is really good if you have a Heimer carry. I'm not listing any items on Heimer because honestly in the late game you don't have a choice of what items you can choose for your like legendary carry, but stuff like Spear of Shojin and Rageblade are very effective on him. We round out this comp with Garen and Taric in the front line, and then Volibear and Ivern as other tanks, and we put the baby dragon in the corner. I think that generally gives the best angle. Some people like putting it in the middle, but I found the most success if I put the baby dragon in the corner. So next up is for Invoker, and this is like the super capped late game comp. And this is where we generally sell our Karma and put all our items on Teemo instead. So if you do end up finding extra copies of Karma, definitely hold on to them if you're trying to pivot to this board. And if you are able to do the full pivot, you could go ahead and replace Soraka and Riven for other units because they're just really not necessary because you're not running a Dawnbringer comp anymore. You're running a 4 Invoker comp instead. So I like to put blue buff on Teemo. I like to put Spear of Shojin on Heimerdinger. So it depends what items you hit before for your Karma. Again, both of those items are pretty much the same power level. And then after that, I like putting the spell crit on the Teemo and then the hat on Heimerdinger, but sometimes you want to put both on whatever units 2 start, so you also have to pay attention to that as well. If you have a Heimer 2, I'll put both items on the Heimer. If I have a Teemo 2, I'll put all the items on the Teemo. And then lastly, you might be wondering, if we don't need the Riven and the Soraka as shown in this picture, what can we replace them with? Well, if you are facing a lot of ability power teams, you could add in 2 Mystics. If you're facing a lot of armor, you could add in some Ironclads, or you could add in random strong units such as Taric 2 and other strong 4 and 5 cost units. The last thing I want to go over for this composition is positioning consideration. So I had a game recently where I had my Karma killed by Thresh hooks like 4 times that game. So you really have to be careful about Forgotten comps because they are becoming pretty popular. Even though Forgotten comps generally run a Draven carry, Draven actually doesn't do any damage to Karma because she's all the way in the back. What ends up killing Karma is a Katarina jump plus a Thresh hook, which generally is enough to kill her because she has pretty low HP. So if you are facing a lot of Forgotten players, definitely make sure you put a different unit in the corner and move Karma to the side a little bit so she isn't always targeted. You could put someone like Soraka or Syndra there. Next up, if you're facing a lot of other Karmas or Invokers, if you face like a Teemo comp, you definitely want to spread out your team because that way you have a low chance of getting AoE'd or your Karma hit by a bunch of units. A lot of people like grouping up against Assassins, but that is a grave mistake if you're facing a Karma or a Teemo player. So against Vel'Koz, you do have to be a little wary of your Karma positioning because you do not want to get bursted down by Vel'Koz. Next up, you want to put Volibear on the same side as their Vel'Koz because he often interrupts the Vel'Koz casting. So essentially, you want Karma and your Volibear on the same side as his Vel'Koz in order to maximize your positioning against one of those teams. Next up is Assassins. So in 6 Dawnbringers, you don't have many tools to fight Assassin players. So generally, like, Sins are gonna just completely beat you out. There's not really too much you can do, but if you are in a 1v1 scenario, you could position all your tanks in the back line, and oftentimes Garen or Volibear can kind of like catch the aggro of some of the Nocturnes out there. So that's really the only thing you can do, and you can really only try that in a 1v1 scenario. Other than that, just try to swap sides really quickly at the last second if there are other players alive. Also against Assassins, you can sometimes just not even position against them and just position against everyone else in your lobby and just accept the loss if you face them. Last up is Aphelios and Draven matchup, so you want to look to position your Volibear and Garen on the same side of their carries because they do AoEs. One thing to note though is if your Volibear is 1-star, he won't be able to actually go off if he is on the same side of the Draven, so you want to make sure you surround him with other units so that he doesn't take the full brunt of the damage. That is pretty much it for this Dawnbringer composition. If you guys want more info on this, I'm going to be releasing like a 3-hour compilation of 6 different Karma games of how I used it to get to Masters or stay in Masters. And that is going to be released hopefully like in a couple of days. I am almost done recording with it. And if you guys are interested in that, definitely go ahead and subscribe below. Apart from that, let me know down in the comments how this comp has been working out for you. And if you have enjoyed this comp so far, or this guide, or this format, go ahead and hit the like button, as that helps me a lot in the kind of like the YouTube metagame. So with that in mind, hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you all later. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe, and of course smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.